Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you as ever from the beaches of the last free state in America, Florida. It is the 5th of January, 2024, our first episode of the new year. I'm honored to have Brian Doherty, co-founder and chairman of Smart Lender Solutions, on with us. Brian, how are you, and how cold is it where you are?
It is freezing and I'm doing well. I've got the heaters at my feet and defrosting properly.
Excellent, excellent. Well, delighted to have you on again. And I know that we've got a couple of very compelling topics. What we're trying to do here for our listeners is make the average American aware of things that sound innocuous, but could turn out to be disastrously expensive. I know that sounds like the bulk of the federal government, but we're going to focus on a couple of things related to technology and financial markets. So take us away, Brian. What was the thing we were talking about in the green room?
Yeah, no, I think the biggest topic of the day would be unhosted wallets and the way that, policymakers are viewing this technology in the sense of how do we, monitor and recover assets that may be stolen or may be used in um, illicit purposes, or maybe even used to, skirt tail bans or even fund terrorism, right? And so policymakers are scratching at their heads trying to figure out how this decentralized technology of blockchain can be, ruled in to be able to provide better oversight and understanding of what's happening on these networks.
So how would you clarify for those who are not familiar with the space? What's a wallet and what is a unhosted versus a hosted wallet?
So in the blockchain crypto space, you have either a custodial wallet or a non-custodial wallet. A custodial wallet is where you have a third party who's maintaining those assets for you. A non-custodial or unhosted wallet is a wallet where you would maintain those keys on your own. So you have a public and private key pair. Your public key pair is what is, known publicly that people would send, say, a token to, and your private key is what allows you to access those tokens to either send or yeah, just send.
So a token could be a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, or it could be something like an NFT that has rights to a piece of art or a piece of land or something. So anything that is tokenized in terms of a cryptographic entity that contains value, hopefully lots, if you're the one who owns it. That's what goes into a wallet. And basically, an unhosted wallet is something that you are personally bearing all the risk of, right? You have it, whether it's a memory stick or a phone card or a computer. And if you lose it, it's like having cash, it's gone. Where in theory, a hosted wallet sitting at a crypto exchange has some degree of fungibility. The exchange will guarantee you get your stuff back if someone robs you. Would those be the main differences most people would see?
Yes, although I think in the crypto sense, what we see with exchanges are a lot of bridge hacks, a lot of, attacks on the actual exchanges themselves. And so for many, and actually manipulation, right? Where tokens may be being said that they're held in reserve for a customer, but might not actually be there. And we've seen this
Which
off,
could happen in the real world anyway. And,
absolutely.
fraud can happen in anything. The bank can tell you, Bernie Madoff, he sent out very compelling statements claiming you had $30 million when you had zero.
Yeah, and I
Nothing
think there
new
was
under the
some.
sun.
Yeah, there was some nickel what you call it, bullion in the UK at one point that I think that was fraudulent here, just a
Yep.
few months ago they found. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, this relates to how authorities currently, law enforcement, are able to deal with digital asset recovery. And that's really the question at hand, because typically law enforcement is always almost always required a third party to kind of facilitate this asset recovery for financial instruments. And now in this new realm of blockchain, right, decentralized ledgers and assets, they're finding it difficult, especially under the guise of the recent terrorist financing that they've discovered. That's been a point of contention. Some people feel it's not enough money, as some people feel it wasn't any money, and ultimately any funding that goes towards some of the horrific things like human trafficking, terrorist financing, I don't care what rock they exist. I would like to make sure that that doesn't happen. I want to ensure that that doesn't facilitate, that any technology doesn't facilitate these criminal behaviors.
Sure.
But at the same token, there is this idea, of the sense of, say, the cryptoverse, a more anarchical view of things where, they don't want the government not just being able to freeze or recover these assets, but obviously don't want them knowing the contents of these wallets as well. And so law enforcement is in this odd predicament where they have to rely on, exchanges such as Binance, which, as we've seen recently, have their own suite of allegations
Already
of
run by
criminal
criminals. So
enterprise.
law enforcement
Yeah.
is asking criminals for help. I want to take a step back and pose this question a little differently, because I gather um, Liz Warren especially is one of the sponsors of some kind of new legislation that, in typical, this is my characterization, in sort of typical federal fashion, finds an irritating mosquito and tries to kill it with a machine gun and a nuclear bomb. Right. Similarly, the analogy to me is very solid in terms of like the crazy governor in New Mexico and others have tried. A criminal uses a stolen gun to shoot someone. Their answer is to make it harder for law-abiding citizens to own a gun. It's ridiculous, right? All
Yeah,
because
you're
they
right.
want to be seen as doing something. They're not doing anything to stop the criminal from stealing a gun, 3D printing a gun, or choosing to use pepper spray and a bat to achieve their aims if they can't find a gun. Um, Similarly, this thing, as I understand it, about unhosted wallets is, if this legislation that Liz is pushing comes through, it basically would turn, as Winston Churchill said, any law that makes an honest man into a criminal is a bad law, right? So if you're
Yeah.
gonna basically call an unhosted wallet a financial service that needs to be regulated, that's insane. For those who haven't done it, you could go to MetaMask, download the software onto your browser, and have a crypto wallet up and running in 30 seconds. And Liz wants to make that an illegal activity without you getting a license from the government. Am I characterizing that correctly?
Fairly well, right? I mean, basically, anytime a developer, which in a few lines of code spins up a public-private key pair, they would have to register potentially with FinCEN. And I think what's interesting about this is, okay, if you were looking at this simply as financial instruments, say through the eyes of cryptocurrencies, right? It's important to understand that blockchain is the foundation technology behind crypto, but has much broader implications on data management and
Yeah.
monetization,
Right.
right? So if I'm creating a data-based blockchain application that has nothing to do with payments or finance whatsoever, then it's almost a burden for the innovation and the developer to have to go and register with FinCEN. It's a waste of their time as well. So it is overshooting, but I would say,
Imagine the
as you,
overload, just conceptually, right? Just
yeah,
imagine the paperwork overload of FinCEN, which is financial enforcement network for registered banks and brokers. Conceptually, if you got, say, 2 million coders in America who, as part of a project they're working on, are each creating 8 or 9 public-private key pairs as part of, say, a college project or whatever they're doing. Suddenly, what you're fielding 7 million applications a week to FinCEN for writing 8 lines of code. I mean, it's madness.
Well, maybe even more when you
Or
consider that we're really at this dawn of, the new data economy. So when you think of the proliferation of smart devices and IoT devices and IPv6, which may be empowered by blockchain, how many IPv6 addresses, and that has nothing to do with, financial transactions. And
right.
ultimately it just either congests the system to where it just doesn't work in the first place. But it puts really just an undue pressure on this early state of this technology. I mean, we're only 14, 15 years in, really.
Yep.
We're just coming into this real understanding that beyond crypto, there's, this greater utility that blockchain offers, and not just as a separate technology, but as something that empowers almost every other emerging technology for data integrity and information security, including AI. Right now, you can really start to understand why would we want to create an atmosphere here in the United States that's very, anti-supportive of really these type of data applications. There's such a proliferation of cyber attacks today, right? We don't have the answers in the legacy environment to solve these problems, and yet we have legislators that are out there that really don't even
Well,
understand,
they've got no
say,
clue. That's a given. No
yeah,
idea what they're talking about.
well, they're taking cues from the media, right? And the media
Yeah.
is only covering the FTXs burning on the side of the
And from the
road.
few lobbyists who have their own particular axe they'd like to grind, where I am big company, mega company X would love if you created an environment such that only my application is legal because it's a $10 million filing fee, and I don't care, I'll do it, but anyone else will just stop. The other thing which I find I always hate this. What was that great book years ago? It's like everything I ever needed to know I learned in kindergarten, right? Like don't cross
Oh
the street
yeah,
without holding hands, or whatever.
yeah,
I remember a third grade teacher told me this, that she made sure to never give an order or a command that she couldn't enforce. Third grade teacher told me
mm,
that. I love that. And I think about
yeah,
this in the context of like switching gears again. Illinois just created this law that everyone who owned an AR-15 in Illinois had to register it from between December 1st and December 31st of 2023. And someone did a statistical analysis basically and said like it's mass non-compliance. So okay, now
yeah,
you basically told 400,000 citizens of Illinois that you are technically now a felon. Really? Really? You're going to go, well, so now what's the mechanism? The state police are going to go with ATF and try to figure out who bought an AR-15 and didn't register. Like, this is worth the taxpayers' time. It's insanity.
yeah,
So
yeah.
you've
It
got,
really is.
and but the reason I think most people don't pay attention to this, they don't watch the machinations of the administrative state, is it's useful to them to have a law in the books with which they can capture anybody, even if they know they're never going to enforce it. When they finally don't like you for some reason, as Harvey Silverglate wrote in his book Three Felonies a Day, right? There is
Yeah,
guaranteed to be a law in the books by which they can arrest any single American citizen at any time and put you in jail. And this is
absolutely.
just
Yeah,
one more of those ridiculous things. Like, Liz doesn't know what she's talking about. She all she's heard is they're using cryptocurrency to finance attacks. They could be using cash. They can be using pure ideological motivation from like-minded people who each hate the same group, and not a single dollar was transferred.
yeah.
So
But
it's
I
a
don't think
complicated
it's,
issue.
yeah, it is. But I think what complicates it even more is there's no sincerity in it, right? I personally don't feel that Elizabeth Warren is worried about, terrorist financing and the use of crypto. That's not her
No,
sincerity. Her sincerity is she's very anti-crypto, which, I agree with, right? I fall along the same lines of, I think that, crypto has very small use case and is a small box of fill compared to, say, blockchain technology, which really
has
has
huge application.
tremendous, yeah, huge.
Yep.
And so, but the sincerity of her arguments ever since 9/11, these are easy arguments to make, right?
Right.
Hey, we got to stop these things because people feel like I just said earlier, hey, I don't want to see human trafficking. I don't want to see anything facilitate these type of horrific things. But that gets me to the point where, the if understanding the edge or understanding the technology would bring, say, law enforcement to this conclusion that, okay, if I found terrorists using a cell network, right, in, Kazakhstan, and, am I going to turn off that cell network because I don't want them using it? Or am I going to observe that cell network to expose other cells that might never have been able to have the intel to find before? Right. So I think if terrorists are using it or if criminals are using blockchain, I don't know if you haven't heard this yet, but it's probably the worst technology on the planet.
Exactly.
Anybody that's done something criminal
It's a
with
complete audit
Bitcoin,
trail.
yeah,
Public.
you will ultimately be found. Like if you were on, Silk Road, guess what? Your day is probably coming because there are tons of data analytic companies right now going through the history of Bitcoin and blockchain, and it's only a matter of time till those type of discoveries are provided,
It's just a matter
right?
of whether they're bothering to look for you, right? Because that's where chain analysis is. That's their origins.
Yeah,
They were
yeah,
helping law enforcement figure out. They're looking for patterns, and they finally put it all together. And like, well, it's a public blockchain, which means the data keeps getting. For those who don't know, the data is public, and it keeps getting added to the chain. Now there are things like
yeah.
machines where you can put it in and kind of randomize, but a good statistical analyst will find that. So
It's
cash
yeah,
is easier. In fact, bumping dollars and euros through multiple accounts, especially if you can snag a couple in dodgy jurisdictions, that can hide a cash trail really, really pretty easily. Meaning, in theory, you could untangle the number of hops, but then the question is, how hard is that? How much does it cost to do? And does a particular government care a lot? Now, if you're a Medellin cartel boss with $10 billion and you decide to give all your wealth to Hamas, there are a lot of governments who are focused on spending what it takes to unravel that knot. But if you're a art fraudster or someone who stole 10 million bucks 8 years ago and you hopped it through 10 banks, is anyone really looking for you?
yeah. Well, I mean, given that scenario you just provided, I mean, if you're a Terracell and you created your own crypto, which you can do in a few lines of code,
Yep.
right? It doesn't need to be on an exchange to have value.
No.
Somebody could provide real world value, gold bullion, and we could use this as something else, right? As a third party money, right? Outside of the realm. And that's all that's going to happen when you kind of employ these type of policies in the first place. But as I was saying, like if I've done a lot of work with law enforcement, including Interpol, on digital asset recovery, and I employ the idea that these type of digital asset recovery frameworks that are going to be required, because ultimately you're talking about people's property,
Yep.
right? So we do need a mechanism to protect consumers, and that's a valid concern no matter what side of the fence you sit on. But the way that they've always looked at it is by requiring, like we said earlier, working with, say, a criminal exchange like Binance. But that puts them in a precarious predicament. But if they understood the technology better, right, they would understand that digital asset recovery allows them to actually freeze and recover tokens that are on unhosted wallets as well, right? And that's without, say, violating a person's privacy. And that can just be done fairly simply just by asking protocol maintainers to create these mechanisms and using a lawful court order to be able to provide some way to, freeze and recover stolen assets. I mean, ultimately, think about BTC, which over 5 billion of ransomware payments alone were paid on BTC to, unencrypt data that was basically criminally, frozen on them.
Right.
And again, I think that this is somebody's property. They have every right to recompense and recovery of these assets. But I think where law enforcement really, before policy is made, right, we really have to do a better understanding of education. And that comes down to even the local police officer that's going to go in to say, you know, an environment where a crime has occurred and understand what does he have to look for in this new digital age, because it could be an NFT that's the key piece of information that puts an entire criminal cell away. It could
Sure.
be some type of token. It could be a wallet address, and if you didn't know what a 12 word seed phrase looked like, then you might overlook that evidence. So there's a great deal of education that has to occur, and we're seeing it everything from, like I said, NFTs and wallet addresses to, I think they just investigated the first virtual rape in the, in the ethereal world. So, I think it's a new age that we're coming into, but a lot of education still has to be really fully understood.
Yeah. Well, here's one thing I always like to emphasize is that since some of the topics we touch on are very public policy oriented, and in theory we live in a representative type of governmental environment, with this, sometimes there are things with massive momentum. Like after Enron collapsed, some politicians saw the opportunity to create a new set of financial regulations. Sarbanes-Oxley was created. But the people at Enron went to jail under the laws that already existed. Sarbanes-Oxley was time-consuming, wasteful public theater for leftists who distrust financial markets, who burdened the stock every single publicly reporting company with tens of thousands to millions of dollars in new expense for literally no reason, because the people
Yeah.
that were at Enron committed fraud, and this new law wouldn't have done anything differently, right? So, and that had real world impacts. We went from like 18,000 listed companies at Enron's time to something like 8,000 now, and a lot of those companies would happily be public. They would share their economics. They would share their equity with public markets, which means that people who own pension funds, individual investors, would have access to those, but they don't, because those companies found that the burden, pointless extra burden of cost to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley wasn't worth it. So when people ask me like, well, why are you so concerned with this boring piece of financial markets regulation? Because it always ends up impacting you, the retail investor. So they
Yeah.
created this entire architecture that accountancy firms love, but has nothing to do with increasing national wealth and increasing your wealth. Similarly, Dodd-Frank, created by Liz Warren and others out of a fantasy that greedy bankers on Wall Street did this to us. No, 10 years of, 10, no, 30 years of terrible federal mortgage housing policy
Yeah.
caused the crash in '07 and '08. But the government, with a large megaphone, has told the world that no, it's greedy bankers, not stupid government policy. And the irony that Barney Frank, one of the architects of stupid federal housing policy, put his name on the piece of legislation designed to suddenly fix this is beyond hilarious in
Yeah.
a way. So that's why we push for this. So in light of those sorts of things, for those people out there who don't pay attention to public policy because you're happier and lead smarter lives, in this instance, Liz Warren and others are trying to push a piece of legislation that literally is a solution in search of a problem that will, if it gets passed, make you a felon. make your
Yeah.
child a felon. Now, in theory, but they will make you a felon for writing lines of code. So, given that that scenario is absolutely completely true, what can we tell people? That they should send a note to their supposed representatives, senators, your congressional representative. They're easy to find. They've got websites. What should they be saying? What should they be writing? And how do we give them the information so they know what it is they're objecting to?
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of information I would give is you eloquently said it, right? That there's already laws on the books covering these things, right? Unregulated securities. Like, we see the SEC, with their teeth and biting into, everything that they can to right now. And that will continue, right? And then we see the ETFs not being passed primarily because of the manipulation of these markets for the last 8 years.
Yep.
So, what I would suggest is, hold fast onto these laws that, we've are grounded in years upon years of precedent, right? Apply the Howey test to, all of these various cryptocurrencies. And, if they pass the test, then have them follow the regulations and laws that are already there. As far
But
as
for
unhosted
those who don't know,
wallets,
what's the Howey test, real quickly?
so the Howey test is a test that was provided, 1933, or I want to say, to find if an offering is a security or a commodity. And by passing the Howey test, it requires you to, provide more regulatory oversight into your offering through the SEC. As a commodity, you don't have those specific requirements. And the Howey test has four parts. She's drawing a blank from me right off the top of my head.
In
Um,
general, it's about looking at the characteristics of something you're selling, and is it a collectible like a Beanie Baby, or is it like a share of stock?
yeah,
Basically,
form over substance, right?
like, is it actually
Yeah.
really, you're giving me access to the rights of profits and losses from a business, but you're trying to tell me it's not a share of stock, so it's a ICO, it's a coin offering,
Yeah.
but in
Yeah.
reality, it's a share of stock. It's just a clever name. You're trying to avoid SEC regulation.
Yeah, and I think the mantra that you hear often is code is law, right? And the reality is law is law. And I think
Right.
a lot of these developers are just coming to the realization, whether you've created a mixer or whether you've created some security, illegal security, right? We're seeing these names of influencers that have been out there for the past 5 years, walking around in Gucci and Prada based on their customers' profits.
Right.
And these guys are finally being held accountable, which is great, right? This is what we want to see. Hopefully, it cleans up some of the more criminal elements of things that are occurring. But we also want to make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and ensure that, we continue to give the United States a competitive advantage in information security, economic security, and energy security. And this is one of the key factors that I think blockchain ushers in, is just this, extension of, say, the internet or TCP/IP's protocol to provide something that's much more secure, faster, and allows for real-time regulatory oversight utilizing, say, triple entry technology, so you don't have those, books, private books of Enron and public books of Enron, right?
Right. That's awesome. So is there actually a draft piece of legislation that we can point people to, or is it still all kind of ideas floating around in Washington?
So I
So I
do
want to make
believe
it
that
really simple for people, right? Lots of our listeners are like, that's really interesting. That's really great. I'm never going to take the time to learn a percentage of what you all spoke about.
yeah.
But if I can send a note to my congressman saying, House Bill 42 sucks, don't sign it, they'll do that. So is there already a thing that we can point them to, or is it more of this generic idea that don't try to regulate, code? That's a little murkier for people. So I like to give people an actionable thing they can do.
Yeah, so it's actually growing in bipartisan support. I can't remember the name of the bill off the
Right.
top of my head.
We'll look it up, and if there is such a thing,
But
we'll put
it's
it in the link.
Yeah, yeah, but it's been a huge push by the Treasury Department to really help law enforcement to be able to have these new authorities within the crypto framework, right? And obviously, you have the policymakers that have kind of taken this and beaten their own drum for their own reasons, and
Right.
no pun intended there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
I,
but it's
I,
true, right? Here's
yeah,
this thing I can look smart about, and who doesn't want to fight child trafficking, right? No one's going to make the link between fighting child trafficking with this nuclear bomb to solve a mosquito problem. That's going to
yeah,
make everyone in America with a computer a felon overnight, and no one knows that. That's what they do all day long. That's why Washington
yeah.
sadly still exists.
Yeah, and as you said before, I mean, it makes people feel like they're doing something, right? But I can tell you from, my, hundreds of discussions with, policymakers on Capitol Hill, this is not something that is very well understood by many,
No.
even by few, right? And I think it's a lot of taking the lessons from or the learnings from, say, what they read in the newspaper or hear on CNBC. And, unfortunately, again, by having some, say, knee jerk reaction to, say, another exchange or another, headline about illicit financing or terrorist financing, I could foresee the Biden administration making some type of executive order. I don't foresee a lot of these bills really doing much except for rabble rousing and
Okay.
saber rattling over the next year, just in the sense of there's not a lot of leadership on these, and again, a lot of the members themselves, they have plenty of other issues and topics that they're dealing with. When you start to get into crypto and blockchain, it's too much, right? But yeah, I think that the biggest advocacy you can do is actually just reaching out, right? And being aware of the situation for one, and reaching out to any of your representatives and just asking them, to really spend the time to understand the situation. Don't just follow suit because of
Ah.
a talking point.
Now we're calling for a wholesale reorganization of how the idiots in Washington work. I say
Yeah,
that with all due kindness. Um, the two examples that they guide me on this, why it's always so much better to prevent legislation from happening, because once it happens, it's almost impossible to unwind. I mean, every as Milton Friedman said, there's no such thing nearly as permanent as a
yeah.
temporary government program. And the USA Patriot Act. I mean, as someone who walked away from the towers on September 11th and will probably die younger because of my lungs, when they were starting to yap about the Patriot Act, I was in D.C. and I was grabbing everyone I can and be like, "This is asinine. This is another example of trying to do something. You think you're going to
Not very
stop
patriotic.
suicidal lunatics from terrorist attacks by more closely examining bank accounts? What are you talking about? But
Yeah.
it put this entire infrastructure in place that added costs to you and your bank account for no reason. And I was in Australia about, oh God, 2 years later, and was dealing with HSBC Australia, HSBC New York, where I had accounts. I had this brain shatteringly painful conversation with Compliance Australia, Compliance New York, who at the time didn't share a mutual time zone, right? So I literally could not get someone in New York on the phone with someone in Sydney during working hours. You know what the issue was? The passport that I had provided to open my account in New York had expired. So they had a picture of my passport. And according to the USA Patriot Act, my bank account was no longer valid because the way the law was written, it ran out. My identity didn't change because my passport fucking expired. It was the dumbest thing. And it was in a microcosm why Congress is so awful.
Yeah.
Because multiply that wasted 14 or 15 hours of my time, of New York for a non-issue, for a
Yeah.
literal non-issue, and that was going to somehow prevent Al Qaeda from flying a plane into something. Asinine.
Yeah.
And this is one more example of that. Billions of dollars of aggregated costs are going to accrue if this stupidity gets passed, and no
Yeah.
one's paying any attention. So
Well,
that's
I think it's not a sexy topic for one, right? Unhosted, non-custodial wallets is not the topic and flavor of the day. But I mean,
no,
it really, as you said, has broad implications upon, again, our economic security, our energy security, our information security. When you're looking at this in the geopolitical realm and you're starting to see, say, China, adopt national blockchain standards, well, we're still talking about crypto and who got paid from the FTX,
right,
envelopes. But and we're not really looking at, say, the things that, say, Jason Lowry, a major in the United States military is talking about with, the implications of how this or what this has on data in general,
right.
right? And so we just need to amplify those type of voices. We need to amplify this type of understanding that it's an extension of today's legacy technology, but providing a much more secure infrastructure for tomorrow and today, right? And that way we don't, make hasty decisions based off, faulty information or even not even well understood information. It's too important of a technology innovation. These things only come around 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
And if we don't get this right, it really puts us at a disadvantage as a nation.
Well said. Here's a fun idea, which will never happen. I would love to do it ahead of voting, but that's not going to happen. But what if you want to watch the Super Bowl, and in order to access the broadcast, you have to answer a 5-question quiz about blockchain?
Yeah.
You have to demonstrate rudimentary understanding
Yeah.
of how this works. And before you're allowed to vote in Congress, you got to pass a 50-question quiz 100% correctly before you're allowed to vote on this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's setting the benchmark high. I would set maybe 3 questions for Congress and, maybe lower. But yeah, nobody would ever watch the Super Bowl at that point,
Right.
unfortunately.
But
But
very
it
rapidly, I think
is,
you'd find tens of millions of Americans within 30 minutes Google something, find out what ChatGPT is, buy a subscription, ask it the
yeah.
question, answer it, and watch the Super Bowl.
Yeah. I bet you would too. Innovation never ceases to exist
Right.
with a
If there's a goal
timeline.
you want to get to, you're gonna
Yeah. You can guarantee an American's gonna figure that one out either. We're all MacGyver
exactly, and you're gonna have
somewhere. We just got to find a motivation to get there.
gotta find the motivation, and you're gonna find all of a sudden a bunch of 12-year-olds hold the key of power over their dads.
Oh yeah. They'll be the ones that doing Roblox or something
Right.
like that.
I
They're the
I could
ones
get
that,
you access to the Super Bowl for
yeah.
say $500.
Oh, you're talking about distributed ledger technology. Oh yeah.
I got that. It's fine. I can do that. Sure.
Yeah.
So 5 questions, huh? How about $200 a question? The price goes up every 10 minutes. Kickoff's happening.
Yeah. Something's gonna happen. Somebody's getting paid in that scenario.
Somebody's getting paid. I love that idea. Well, anyway, Ryan, thanks for taking the time. Hopefully, we can do our bit to stem creeping technocratic totalitarianism, which, to be fair, most of these idiots voting for it don't think that's what they're voting for, but that
Yeah.
is in effect what they'd be voting for. Any last words of wisdom for the people as 2024 dawns?
Trust and verify, right? Like
There
I
you
guess that
go.
would be.
There you go. That's very optimistic. I would have said don't trust and verify, but that's
Yeah.
fair enough. I like the optimism. And everyone else, my favorite listeners, which we love that you're here, coming into I think season 5 now, which is very exciting for us here at the Amateur Messy Time Studios. Remember to turn off the mainstream media who are lying to you and tune into Messy Times.